There are places in this world that feel less like scenery and more like guardians. My place was not a sprawling national park or a jagged snow-capped range. It was one mountain, a modest slope rising behind my home, clothed in wild juniper and whispering pine, that seemed to breathe in rhythm with me each morning. The mist curled down its ridges like soft breath over skin. In spring, wildflowers dotted its shoulder, tiny bursts of red and yellow woven into green. Every sunrise poured down its side like golden syrup sliding off warm bread. And for years, I sat on my deck with a mug of bitter black coffee, watching light spill across her curves, believing I had finally found peace. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 62 years old, a retired geotechnical engineer who spent 3 decades warning people where not to build. I mapped fault zones, studied floodplains, marked unstable slopes, and testified more times than I can remember in hearings where developers begged cities for permits to defy nature. I lost count of how many projects I tried to stop, but I never forgot the look in people's eyes when warnings turned into disasters. Some of those scars I carried home with me. Some were carved deeper than rock. When my wife died after a brutal fight with cancer, I left Fresno, sold the suburban house we'd built our lives in, and came here, to this quiet community at the base of a mountain I thought no one would ever bother. For a while, I was right. The neighborhood was small, made up of retired teachers, a wildlife photographer who rented cabins to birders, and a few families who had traded city noise for silence. There was no gate, no covenants, no manicured lawns or committee meetings, just homes tucked into pines, kids playing in dry creek beds, and the comfort of knowing everyone waved when you drove past. For a man hollowed out by grief, it was the closest thing to healing I could imagine that lasted almost 7 years. Then she arrived. Her name was Veronica Cole, though most neighbors began calling her Madam President before she even announced her intentions. She was 50 but sculpted to look 40, hair dyed, the shade of wheat that never dulled, her skin glowing with the sheen of expensive spas. She moved into the largest available lot, high on the slope above me, in a home that looked more like a gallery than a residence. 6 bedrooms, glass walls, marble patios. She owned a dog no one had ever seen on a hike, only in manicured walks along the cul-de-sac, and from the moment she arrived, she behaved less like a neighbor and more like a monarch surveying territory she intended to rule. Within months, a homeowners association was formed. At first, it seemed harmless: shared trash service, consolidated mailboxes, a landscaping fund. But Veronica was not content with trash pickup. She drafted a 35-page covenant update that dictated grass length, mailbox colors, and even the species of trees allowed in front yards. Most residents grumbled. Some ignored it. But when she tacked on view preservation clauses forbidding any tree over 6 feet that might obstruct her panorama, I knew the mountain had caught the eye of someone who thought sky could be owned. I avoided meetings, as I always had. Retirement had given me the freedom to spend mornings with binoculars instead of spreadsheets. But one evening, a notice landed in my mailbox that forced me into the clubhouse. Veronica wanted to grade the upper slope for future development, 6 luxury lots with sweeping valley views. My heart clenched the moment I read the proposal. I knew that soil. It was decomposed granite, layered with fractured shale, held together not by stability but by roots and time. It was the kind of terrain that tolerated life so long as no one tried to cut into it, and she wanted to dynamite it at that meeting. I stood and spoke. My voice shook with the weight of memory. That slope is unstable. Blast it, and you risk landslides. I've seen what happens when people gamble with decomposed granite. Whole orchards vanish, streets buckle, lives are lost. Veronica smiled at me with the kind of practiced grace that belongs to someone who has never been told no. "We've consulted with an architect," she said, her tone dismissive. "The design is perfectly safe." I almost laughed. Architects are artists of structure. They sketch and dream, but soil does not care about sketches. I was a geotechnical engineer for 30 years. I replied, "That mountain will not hold if you cut into it." She tilted her head, lips curved into pity. "Mr. Mercer, you're retired, aren't you? Perhaps it's time to enjoy your mornings instead of worrying about things beyond your control." That dismissal cut deeper than I expected. My wife used to say grief makes you quieter, but sometimes silence feels like complicity. The month that followed felt like watching a fuse burn toward dynamite. Permits moved faster than I had ever seen. A county consultant with suspiciously vague credentials rubber-stamped reports that looked more like templates than analysis. And then came the first blast. I was on my porch when the mountain groaned. The sound rattled windows and sent my coffee spilling across the table. Dust rose in a cloud that smeared the horizon gray. Birds scattered in frantic spirals. I stood there frozen, my chest tight, feeling the ground beneath me quiver as if the mountain herself exhaled in pain. When the dust cleared, a jagged wound scarred the slope where once there had been terraces of juniper and wildflowers. My hands shook, not from age but from rage. Veronica celebrated the blast like a ribbon cutting. She called reporters, hired drones, unveiled banners that read the summit at Pinecrest, elevated living. Investors sipped champagne on temporary platforms while the mountain bled dust behind them. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my arms crossed, the taste of grit on my tongue. She spoke about prestige and transformation, about homes that would redefine luxury. She never mentioned erosion, aquifers, or fox dens. She never mentioned the orchard buried in a slide 40 years ago just a mile east of here. She smiled like she had conquered something alive. I went home that night and pulled out old maps from my career. I marked fault lines, slope angles, historical slides. I photographed the new scar at dawn when shadows revealed fractures. I bought trail cameras and planted them like silent sentinels along the tree line. Every day, I logged soil movement with reference stakes, recording millimeters like they were heartbeats. A folder began to grow on my desk. HOA Negligence Phase 1. The more evidence I gathered, the louder Veronica's campaign became. She mailed newsletters, smearing me as a bitter obstructionist, accusing me of paranoia. Mr. Mercer, it read, while respected in his former career, has not practiced for over a decade. His claims are speculative and unfounded. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Some whispered apologies when no one else could hear. At the next meeting, Veronica pushed a motion to restrict residents from offering unsolicited expert opinions unless requested by the board. It passed by a single vote. My voice had been erased from the official record, but the mountain doesn't care about votes. That September, a drizzle swept across the valley. Barely an inch of rain. The next morning, I found a sheet of red dirt 6 inches thick against my fence line. Roots that once held the slope together had been stripped away by blasting. Without them, water carved channels like knives through flesh. I measured the slide with my old survey rod and logged it. Then I went inside, poured myself another bitter cup of coffee, and stared at the folder on my desk. It was no longer about my piece. It was about survival. I called an old colleague, a junior engineer I'd mentored years ago named Samuel. He confessed he'd been hired for a preliminary consultation on the slope but dropped when his report flagged severe instability post-blast. The developer switched analysts and buried his findings. When I asked if he'd testify, his paws stretched heavy over the line. Finally, he said, if it saves lives, yes. By October, clouds gathered again. Forecasts whispered the phrase every slope expert dreads: atmospheric river, days of steady rain that saturate soil until gravity wins. I walked my property reinforcing drainage, moving photo albums to higher shelves, sealing vents. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed I had misread the mountain. The rain began as a soft percussion on leaves. My trail cameras lit up with motion alerts, tiny slumps, rivulets carving fresh scars. At 2:14 a.m., one feed captured 20 feet of slope sliding off like wet clay. I screenshotted it, labeled it, and felt my stomach knot. The mountain was no longer warning. She was shifting dot by dawn. Crews were back on site pouring concrete for retaining walls. As if duct tape could hold back a tidal wave, Veronica appeared in a white raincoat and matching boots, clipboard in hand, pretending control. I shouted across the fencing, "You lost part of the slope last night. Shut this down." She waved me off. "Our contractors are experienced. The wall will hold." I asked if she'd tested absorption rates, reviewed lateral scans. She turned to her cousin, Vince, the contractor, and said, "Remove him." I stepped back, rain dripping from my hood. "Remember this conversation," I said, "because when the slope moves again, there will be timestamps, there will be video, and the world will know." Vince smirked. Veronica rolled her eyes, and the mountain kept whispering. That night, the drizzle became a torrent. Water rushed down gutters like rivers. The creek at the southern edge of the neighborhood leapt its banks, swallowing the walking trail. At 3:37 a.m., the sound came. Not a whisper, not a sigh, a roar. Deep, ancient, and merciless. I ran to my back deck, flashlight in hand, and watched as the slope broke. Earth rolled downward, slow at first, then faster, devouring trees, fences, and finally the gleaming frame of Veronica's mansion perched closest to the edge. It did not crumble. It disappeared, swallowed whole by a wave of soil and stone. The lights flickered out. The roar faded into silence. Then came the screaming. The silence after the roar was almost worse than the landslide itself. It felt as though the earth had exhaled and then held its breath, waiting to see what remained. My flashlight beam cut through the haze of dust and rain, catching broken trunks and fragments of fences sliding past like toys. Somewhere up the hill, voices shouted, faint, panicked. A floodlight blinked on near the construction trailers, its beam shaking as if the very pole beneath it trembled. I heard radios crackle, men yelling, but the house that had dominated the slope only hours before was gone by dawn. Sirens wailed up the road, red and blue lights flashing against sheets of rain. Fire engines, ambulances, and county search and rescue trucks rumbled in, their tires slapping mud like war drums. Neighbors emerged in boots and blankets, clustering at the bottom of the hill, eyes wide, faces pale. Some whispered prayers, some just stared as if staring might undo what they saw. Veronica stood among them, her pristine raincoat streaked with mud, her mascara smeared down her cheeks. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was silent, staring at the wound in the mountain as if she had summoned it herself. I didn't speak to her. I didn't need to. Everything I had warned about was there, plain, undeniable. Gravity had written the verdict in soil and stone that morning. While the neighborhood buzzed with panic and search crews dragged equipment toward the scar, I loaded every file, every time-stamped image, every soil log into a waterproof case. I drove it down the highway in the steady rain and walked it directly into the county planning office, the city council desk, and finally the ethics commission mailbox. And then, for good measure, I sent digital copies to every journalist I had ever known. This was no longer a community squabble. It was a scandal. Within hours, the first helicopters circled overhead, cameras panning across the destruction. From the air, the landslide looked like an open wound, a jagged gash in the slope carved deep and wide. News anchors spoke in somber tones. Luxury development destroyed in mountain collapse. Was this preventable? Footage of the press event where Veronica had promised transformation played on a loop beside the scar where her house had been. And then, inevitably, the phone calls began. Neighbors texted me in a flurry. "She's blaming you. Did you hear what she said? Michael, please tell me you're documenting this." I hadn't seen her speak yet, but when I switched on the local channel, there she was, standing beneath a borrowed canopy, sunglasses hiding swollen eyes, voice trembling with carefully rehearsed concern. "We are working closely with county officials and structural experts to understand the unexpected geological instability that has affected our beloved community. Our thoughts are with everyone impacted, especially our neighbors who've lost their homes." Neighbors, she meant herself. And then she added the part that nearly made me choke on my coffee. "Unfortunately, certain individuals have spread misinformation that may have complicated response efforts and fueled unnecessary panic." I laughed, bitter and sharp. Even buried under 30 feet of mud, she was still trying to spin blame. But I was ready. The file I had delivered the night before was airtight. Photos with times, drone footage from the slump days before, Samuel's memo warning of slope instability, and my own logs, line by line, measuring soil movement in millimeters. It wasn't hysteria, it was science. 2 days later, the county's head of planning, Dean Rollins, called me directly. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since a project near Santa Rosa where he'd been a young intern shadowing me through a slope assessment. His voice was older now, heavier. "Michael, I saw the footage. It's bad. It's worse than bad," I said. "The rest of that slope is still moving." There was a pause. "We're going to need a formal deposition. Would you testify if this goes to court?" Gladly. By that evening, county officials had cordoned off the upper lots with yellow tape and metal barricades. Emergency stop work orders were plastered against the half-built mansions. Still, Veronica remained defiant. I saw her at the site, shouting at a young inspector, waving papers and stomping her mud-caked boots as though tantrums could stop geology. I hosted a meeting that night on my back porch. No chandeliers, no catered water bottles, just 2 pots of coffee and a bottle of scotch for whoever needed something stronger. Nearly 30 people showed up, some soaked from walking through the rain, some clutching files of insurance papers, some simply shaking with fear. They sat in mismatched chairs, perched on the railing, huddled in blankets while the mountain loomed above us, its silhouette broken and raw. "She lied to us," Rosa said, her voice thick with tears. "She said the reports were fine. She told us everything was under control." Tom, an accountant with 2 young kids, spoke next. "My insurance won't cover this. They flagged the hillside as high risk and I didn't opt for supplemental. Nobody told me it was required. Do we have grounds to sue?" The faces turned toward me heavy with expectation. I wasn't used to being anyone's leader anymore. But the silence pressed, and I realized they weren't just angry. They were scared. Scared their homes were next. Were scared their lives and savings had been gambled away by one woman's arrogance. "I've already filed complaints with the county and the state board," I told them. "If we act together, we can push for a full audit of the HOA's actions. We can request an injunction. And yes, we can push for her removal." Someone laughed bitterly. "She fight us, then let her," I said, "because this time, the ground is on our side." That night, a signature sheet began to circulate. By dawn, 40 names filled its lines. The landslide had shifted more than soil. It had shifted trust. For a few days, the neighborhood hung in eerie silence, broken only by the buzz of helicopters and the rumble of county trucks. Then came the whispers. Not from Veronica directly, she was too careful for that. But in Facebook groups, in anonymous flyers slipped into mailboxes, inside conversations after meetings. Not saying it's his fault, but spreading panic can destabilize construction timelines. Michael Mercer spent nights on the slope with cameras. How do we know he wasn't tampering? I ignored it at first, but when I opened my mailbox one morning to find an unmarked envelope with a single typed line, "The mountain fell because you wanted it to," I carried it straight to the sheriff's office. Deputy Harmon read it twice. Deputy Harmon read it twice. Jaw tight. "Do you think this came from her?" "I think it came from someone she's happy to let believe the lie." He sealed it in evidence plastic and told me to be careful. Careful, as if caution could stop a smear campaign. But I wasn't alone anymore. Rosa and Tom pushed the recall petition further. Neighbors rallied, and a civil attorney named Dana Merriweather entered the scene. She was sharp, methodical, and furious in the way only someone who has watched power abuse people too many times can be. She offered pro bono counsel. "This isn't just negligence," she said at our first meeting in her cramped office. "This is systemic failure wrapped in designer heels." Together we drafted a pre-litigation notice of defamation and negligence against the HOA board. It included 300 pages of exhibits, my logs, Samuel's memo, drone footage, soil surveys, everything. We also requested internal communications, meeting transcripts, and proof of receipt for my reports. The pressure was building, and Veronica's legal team tried to stall, but while they dragged their heels, the state task force released its preliminary findings. The report was brutal. It stated plainly that blasting and grading had destabilized the slope in direct violation of multiple codes. It listed willful disregard of geological advice, and in bold print, it included a timeline of warnings submitted by resident engineer Michael Mercer. The news cycle shifted overnight, where days before I was whispered about as a saboteur. Now anchors introduced me as the whistleblower who warned of the collapse. Local stations ran interviews with neighbors who remembered my speeches. One headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen: "Hero or Villain? Engineers' warnings confirmed." Veronica struck back with a new lawyer, a man named Byron Hale, who dressed like a television anchor and spoke like a priest. He held a press conference in front of the fenced-off site with Veronica at his side. "This was a tragedy rooted in unpredictable environmental shifts," he said smoothly. "Assigning blame to well-meaning community leaders serves no one, and we must not be misled by individuals presenting themselves as experts without current licenses. Facts must guide our response, not vendettas." That night, I sat on my back porch with cameras pointed at the mountain, my laptop open to a live newsfeed. Dana called me. "It's time you speak for yourself." The interview was filmed the next morning on my deck, the scar of the landslide looming behind me under gray tops. The anchor asked, "Did you predict this?" I answered, "I didn't predict it. I documented it. I warned it would happen, and I was ignored." She asked, "Do you believe the HOA is trying to make you the scapegoat?" I said, "Power doesn't like accountability. When they can't silence you with process, they try to smear your name. Do you feel vindicated?" she asked last. I paused, staring at the mountain. "No, because vindication means I got what I wanted. I never wanted this. I wanted them to stop before the mountain did what mountains always do when you carve too deep. They correct arrogance." The segment aired that evening. Messages poured in from strangers, geologists, survivors of other HOA battles. Some warned me Veronica wouldn't stop. They were right. A week later, she filed a countersuit accusing me of causing unrest and destabilizing the project timeline, which she claimed had contributed to the collapse. It was absurd, but it forced another hearing. The courthouse smelled of stale coffee and fear. Dana stood beside me like a blade, dressed in linen, her folder color-coded and thick. Across the aisle, Veronica sat in navy power colors, flanked by Byron and another lawyer imported from San Francisco. The hearing was short, the issue clear: whether my warnings counted as protected speech under California's anti-SLAPP law. Dana's voice was calm, her words precise. Mr. Mercer submitted geological assessments substantiated by photos and expert memos. The HOA ignored them. A landslide destroyed property and endangered lives. Now they attempt to silence him by claiming his warnings caused the disaster he tried to prevent. That is not justice. That is retaliation, Byron countered, smooth as glass. This is hindsight bias. The permits were valid, contractors licensed. Mr. Mercer's alarmist communications delayed responses and fueled panic. The judge, a nonsense woman named Justice Bollinger, leaned forward. "You're arguing that a man warning of slope failure caused the slope to fail." Byron hesitated, then said, "His messaging influenced perception." She frowned. "I've reviewed the evidence. If Mr. Mercer's documentation is accurate, I'm not sure why we're even here." Motion granted. The defamation countersuit is dismissed with prejudice. The HOA will pay respondents' fees. The gavel struck like thunder. Veronica blinked in disbelief. Byron leaned in to whisper, but she didn't move. She just stared at the table, her empire cracking beneath her like her mansion had. Outside, cameras waited. Dana spoke first. "This is a victory for truth, for accountability, and for every resident silenced by bureaucracy." Michael Mercer did what the HOA would not. He listened to the land. Reporters turned to me. I didn't want to speak, but I did. This was never about me. It's about making sure what happened on this mountain doesn't happen again. Because geology doesn't forgive signatures or bias. It only obeys gravity. That evening, the recall vote was finalized. 87% demanded Veronica's removal. Her cousin Vince resigned quietly. Cynthia, the board member who once argued hammocks should be banned, cited health reasons and left. By the end of the week, the board was dissolved. For the first time in years, the HOA no longer belonged to her. The mountain still loomed scarred and raw. But for the first time, it felt like the ground beneath us might shift in a better way. The week after the court ruling, I received an official summons from the state ethics panel. They wanted testimony. not just about the landslide, but about the entire permitting process that had allowed it to happen. The panel would include city planners, environmental protection officers, and representatives from the Division of Geological Safety. It was bigger than one HOA now. It was about how greed cloaked itself in paperwork and slipped past the very safeguards meant to protect people. When I walked into the state building, the air smelled of rain-soaked concrete and fresh paint. The hearing room was packed with reporters, staffers, and citizens who had come to watch the fallout. The panelists sat behind long tables stacked with files, their expressions grave. I laid down my maps, my overlays, the drone footage, the soil logs, Samuel's suppressed memo, everything. Then I walked them through the timeline step by step. From the first covenant drafted by Veronica to the night the mountain roared. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I simply explained the truth as the land had shown me. How blasting destabilized decomposed granite, how rainwater exploited fractures, how every warning I submitted had been ignored or buried. You can legislate against noise, I told them. You can legislate paint colors and mailbox height, but you cannot legislate geology. Soil obeys gravity, not boards or bylaws. One of the younger officials, a woman with dark hair pulled into a bun, looked at me with something close to reverence. You turned grief into action, she said softly. I shook my head. I didn't do this because I was brave. I did it because the mountain screamed and no one else listened. The report that followed was scathing. It cited willful negligence, improper grading, fraudulent permitting, and systemic HOA abuse of authority. It recommended sweeping reforms, including stricter geotechnical oversight for any private developments near slopes, whistleblower protections for residents, and mandatory state audits for HOAs engaged in large-scale projects. Veronica's name appeared in bold alongside words like reckless disregard and failure of duty. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood shifted. With the board dissolved, Rosa and Tom were elected as interim co-chairs. They approached me on a cool morning while I was clearing debris from my yard. We want you to join the new board, Tom said, offering me a clipboard already full of signatures of support. I shook my head. I've had enough of politics. Rosa smiled gently. This isn't politics. It's stewardship. That word stayed with me. Stewardship. I declined the board seat, but I agreed to lead the restoration committee. For once, the community wasn't trying to control nature but to heal it. We worked with state-funded restoration teams and a small non-profit focused on native species. We laid down natural fiber mats, planted deep-rooted grasses, redirected runoff channels, and mapped every risk zone with care. For the first time, management of the mountain was guided by intelligence instead of arrogance. We proposed a permanent ban on development along the scarred slope. No new houses, no terracing, no fences. The land would become a protected preserve, a sanctuary for wildlife and a living reminder of what happens when greed ignores geology. Some residents resisted. One man named Douglas, who had bought a discounted lot after the slide, sued the board for loss of potential development value. He lost. The county had already deemed the land permanently The ruling was final. Veronica, meanwhile, vanished. For weeks no one saw her. Rumors swirled that she was hiding in a luxury spa, that she was staying at Cynthia's house, that she was planning a comeback. Then, one morning, a moving truck appeared at her mansion's remains. Cream-colored furniture, abstract art, and glass vases were carried out, caked in mud but still labeled carefully. By afternoon, her car was gone. She didn't leave an announcement, not even a goodbye. She had built her empire too close to the edge, and the edge had taken it back. Months later, on a warm spring afternoon, I found a letter in my mailbox. The envelope was ivory with gold edging. Inside, a single handwritten line. You were right. I hope the mountain forgives me. I don't expect you to. No signature. None was needed. That night I burned the letter in my fire pit. Not out of anger, but because I didn't want to carry her guilt along with mine. Time softened the scars. Where jagged earth had torn open, shoots of grass began to stitch green threads across the wound. Wildflowers sprouted along the edges. Birds returned. The air smelled of pine again. Slowly, the mountain began to heal. The new board held a community vote and renamed the scarred land Silver Ridge Memorial Park. But among neighbors, it was simply called the mountain. We installed walking trails that curved gently around the landslide zone. Interpretive signs explained erosion, geology, and native plants. At the center of it all, we placed a stone marker carved with one line, in memory of the land lost, and the warnings not heard. The dedication ceremony was not glamorous. No drones, no banners, no champagne. Just neighbors gathered under cottonwoods. Children chasing butterflies, parents sipping lemonade, couples holding hands. Rosa read a short poem. Tom gave a simple thank you speech, and then we stood in silence, letting the wind move through the grasses where mansions were once supposed to rise. Not long after, the county awarded me the Community Resilience Medal. It was a quiet ceremony. No press, just neighbors and a few officials. They handed me the medal in a small box. But the real honor was watching Rosa and Tom shake hands with Martina, the young geologist from Sacramento who had told me, "You did everything you were supposed to." For once, It felt like the right people were in the room still. One final chapter remained out. One morning, nearly a year after the landslide, I sat on a weathered bench overlooking the valley. The bench was made from an oak tree that had fallen during the storm, carved and smoothed by my own hands. The sunrise spilled over the mountain, painting it gold. I heard footsteps crunched softly behind me. A voice asked, "May I sit?" I turned. Veronica. She was older now, smaller somehow, her face bare of makeup. Her clothes, practical hiking boots and a fleece jacket. There was no entourage, no jewelry, no power colors. Just a woman carrying weight she could not shed. I nodded, and she sat beside me. For a long time, we said nothing. The wind moved through the grass. A hawk circled overhead. Finally she spoke. "I sold the last property, the one near the highway. I've been volunteering at an environmental education center in Colorado, teaching kids about watershed systems." I looked at her. "Do you tell them about Silver Ridge?" She gave a short, broken laugh. "Only the parts I can say without choking." We sat in silence again. Then I asked, "Why are you here?" She looked down at her hands. They were lined with soil, fingernails, dirty. I needed to see it one last time. "This place isn't about you anymore," I said quietly but firmly. "I know," she replied. "That's why it's beautiful now." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small stone, smooth and dark, shaped like a teardrop. "I found this near the base of the slide," she said. "I kept it all this time." She placed it on the bench between us and stood. She didn't ask for forgiveness, not from me. She walked down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I never saw her again, but the stone remained. Neighbors sometimes moved it, set it upright, balanced it on its edge, but no one ever took it. Everyone understood what it was. A marker, a memory, a reminder. On the 1-year anniversary of the landslide, we gathered at the park again, not for ceremony, but for community. Children ran through the meadow where Veronica's mansion had once stood. Couples walked the trail. Rosa read another poem. Tom offered thanks. I said nothing. I simply listened to the breeze through the cottonwoods and felt the mountain's silence, not the ominous silence of waiting, but the true silence of rest. As the gathering ended, a young boy approached me, maybe 10 years old, holding his father's hand. "Are you the man who saved the mountain?" he asked. I knelt beside him. "No," I said. "The mountain saved itself. I just refused to look away." He smiled and ran off to chase butterflies. I turned to his father. He looked at me with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "Take care of this place," I told him. "One day it will be yours to protect, because that is the truth of all things worth loving. They outlive us. They grow back through cracks we thought permanent. They forgive slower than we ask, but deeper than we deserve. And in the end, they teach us the most humbling lesson of all. The land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it." The weeks after Veronica's departure felt like the slow lifting of a storm. For the first time in years, the air in Silver Ridge carried something lighter than suspicion. There were no glossy newsletters filled with rules, no HOA fines taped to doors, no smug speeches at mandatory meetings. Instead, there were neighbors standing together at trailheads with shovels and saplings, trying to mend the land with their own hands. It was not organized at first. It was messy, clumsy, but it was real. Children dug holes too wide for seedlings. Retirees carried buckets of mulch in wheelbarrows older than the neighborhood itself. Teenagers who once rolled their eyes at community projects hauled bags of soil up the scar like soldiers in a quiet war. We were not building mansions anymore. We were building memory. I walked among them, offering advice on where to plant, how deep to set roots, how to angle drainage away from fragile cuts in the slope. I was not their leader. I was their neighbor. But the weight of my words carried differently now. No one dismissed them. No one rolled their eyes. They listened, not because I demanded it, but because the mountain had proven me right in the harshest way possible. Still, not everyone accepted the new vision. A handful of residents grumbled at the idea of declaring the slope a permanent preserve. They saw only lost investments, not gained safety. One man, Douglas, filed a lawsuit claiming that the designation robbed him of potential profit. He stood in front of a county judge waving glossy blueprints of a dream house that would never exist, insisting he was owed compensation. The judge barely let him finish before ruling against him. "The land is unbuildable," she said. "It will remain You cannot sue the earth into compliance." Douglas stormed out, his papers soaked in rain on the courthouse steps. For the rest of us, the work continued. Slowly, the scar softened. Tops gave way to grasses. Grasses gave way to wildflowers. Deer returned along the lower ridges, cautious at first, then bolder. One morning I spotted a fox trotting along the trail where a retaining wall was once planned. It paused, looked at me with sharp amber eyes, and disappeared into the brush. For the first time in years, I smiled without bitterness. Thought the state-funded restoration teams brought in students from universities, bright-eyed geologists, environmental science majors, young people eager to turn textbooks into action. They asked me questions, took notes, and walked the slope beside me. Sometimes I caught them looking at me with something like admiration, but I always shook my head. "Don't make me into a hero," I told them. The mountain was the teacher. I just refused to stop listening. News coverage dwindled as months passed. What had once been a scandal splashed across headlines faded into back-page updates. That was fine with me. The cameras could chase newer disasters. Ours was no longer about spectacle. It was about recovery. Yet the scars of the landslide lived inside us as well. Rosa confessed one night over coffee that she still woke at 3:41 a.m., the exact time the slope had given way. Tom admitted he checked the foundation of his home every morning, even when there had been no rain for weeks. And me, I dreamed of the roar. Not every night, but enough. Sometimes I woke clutching my chest as if the sound itself pressed down on me. But when dawn came and the mountain was quiet, I felt a different kind of weight. Not dread. Responsibility. That responsibility deepened when the interim board asked me to help draft new budget. I hesitated at first. I had sworn I was done with politics. But Rosa reminded me it was not about power. It was about protection. We can't erase what happened, she said, but we can make sure it never happens again. So we wrote them, line by line, clause by clause. No development on slopes deemed unstable by independent engineers. Mandatory annual audits of HOA finances by external reviewers. Full transparency of board communications, and most importantly, the right of any resident to submit expert opinion without censorship. It was, in essence, the opposite of everything Veronica had built. Instead of silencing voices, it amplified them. Instead of bending rules for power, it locked them in place for safety. When the bylaws passed, there was no champagne, no speeches, no smug applause, just a collective exhale, as if the community itself had signed a truce with its conscience. Seasons shifted. The wildflower meadow where Veronica's mansion had once stood bloomed with fireweed and lupin. The scars of the landslide turned green, then golden, then white with snow, each season stitching itself into the memory of the land. The community garden Rosa proposed flourished, rows of vegetables and herbs thriving in soil once considered cursed. Children played tag between raised beds. Neighbors shared meals from crops they had planted together. It was in that garden. One afternoon, that a man approached me I didn't recognize. He was in his 40s. With calloused hands and weary eyes. "You don't know me," he said, "but my brother died in a landslide near Monterey 15 years ago. I saw your interview on TV. Thank you for not letting them bury the truth." His voice cracked on the last word. I shook his hand and realized again that this story had never just been about us. Landslides didn't care about property lines. They were universal reminders of arrogance undone. Veronica's shadow never fully left. From time to time, her name appeared in whispers rumors. She was lecturing at some real estate symposium in Denver. Or that she had joined an environmental nonprofit trying to redeem her name. Once, a neighbor swore they saw her hiking the new trail at dawn, who'd pulled low, vanishing into the trees before anyone else arrived. I didn't know if it was true. I didn't care. The mountain didn't care either. It had forgiven slower than she asked, but deeper than she deserved. On the first anniversary of the landslide, we held a gathering at the meadow. Not a memorial, not exactly a celebration, but something in between. Children ran through fields of wildflowers, their laughter echoing against the slopes. Rosa read a poem about resilience. Tom thanked volunteers. I said nothing. I stood beneath the cottonwoods and listened to the breeze moving through the leaves. The sound soft, steady, alive. A boy, maybe 10, approached me then. His father held his hand, but the boy looked straight at me with eyes full of curiosity. "Are you the man who saved the mountain?" he asked. I knelt so we were level. "No," I said. "The mountain saved itself. I just refused to look away." The boy smiled, nodded, and ran off to join the other children. His father lingered a moment longer. "Thank you," he said simply. I nodded. "Take care of this place. One day it'll be yours to protect." The words stayed with me long after he left, because that was the truth, wasn't it? The land outlives us. It waits through our mistakes, groans under our arrogance, then heals in its own time. We pretend ownership with deeds and signatures, but in the end, land always reminds us who really belongs to whom. That evening I walked the trail alone. The archway at the entrance had been built from reclaimed wood, simple but strong, with a hand-carved inscription, "Tread gently. The mountain remembers." I paused there, ran my hand over the letters, and felt something I hadn't felt since before my wife passed. Peace, not the fragile peace of silence, but the steady peace of knowing that even when we fail, even when greed blinds us, the earth has its own way of teaching us to listen. The sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in hues of crimson and violet. I sat on the weathered bench overlooking the valley, the teardrop stone still resting between planks, untouched. A hawk circled above, its shadow sweeping across the meadow where once a mansion stood, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself breathe with the mountain again. The second spring after the landslide arrived with a softness none of us expected. Snow melted into rivulets that ran clean through the gullies, carrying with them the last fragments of broken timber and concrete buried deep in the soil. Where once there had been jagged scars, green shoots now stretched upward, stubbornly, defiantly, as if the mountain itself was reminding us that survival was not a miracle but a habit. Every morning I walked the trail from my back, porch to the overlook where Veronica's mansion once stood. I carried a thermos of coffee, black and bitter, the way my wife used to drink it, and I sat on the same weathered bench carved from that fallen oak. The teardrop stone still rested there, moved sometimes by children curious about its weight, but never taken. It had become part of the park, part of the story. People who didn't know where it came from still seemed to understand it was sacred. Silver Ridge Memorial Park was no longer an idea on paper. It was alive. Schools brought students on field trips, their voices echoing down the valley as they traced diagrams of erosion and pointed to wildflowers blooming where foundations once cracked. Birdwatchers returned with tripods and lenses, whispering with delight when foxes darted across trails. The community garden flourished, its rows of vegetables shared freely among neighbors who had once eyed each other with suspicion across HOA meetings. I never joined the new board, but I attended their gatherings. They were different now. No chandeliers, no posturing, no champagne. Just folding chairs in the park, people discussing drainage improvements, native plantings, or how to organize cleanup days. When someone spoke, others listened. When decisions were made, they were about safety, not prestige. The bylaws we had drafted after the disaster held strong. No development on unstable slopes, mandatory transparency, protection of resident voices, and every year, an independent geological audit confirmed what we had learned the hard way, that the mountain was not a commodity to be carved, but a neighbor to be respected. Sometimes, when I walked the ridge at dusk, I thought of Veronica. I wondered if she still carried that guilt in her chest like a stone, or if she had learned to set it down. I never saw her again after that morning she left the teardrop behind. Maybe she found peace teaching children about watersheds in Colorado. Maybe she never found it at all. Either way, the mountain had forgiven in its own slow, steady way. And so had we. One evening, Rosa invited me to speak at a community event marking the 2-year anniversary of the slide. I hesitated. I wasn't a man who liked microphones anymore. But when I stood before neighbors, the meadow behind me blooming with wildflowers, I realized there was something left to say. I used to think silence was peace. I began that the best way to survive was to keep my head down and let others make their mistakes. But the mountain taught me otherwise. Silence can be complicity. Speaking up is not always comfortable, but it is necessary, because the earth doesn't lie. It only obeys gravity. And if we ignore what it tells us, we pay the price. The crowd was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant they were listening. Children clutched their parents' hands. Neighbors nodded. I ended simply, this park isn't a monument to disaster. It's a promise that we will remember, and that we will tread gently. Later that night, as I walked home along the trail, fireflies blinked among the grasses, tiny lanterns marking my path. I stopped once more at the bench. The stone was still there, dark against the wood, catching the faint glow of the moon. I left it untouched. Some things are not meant to be carried away. The following morning I awoke to find an envelope on my porch. No return address. Just plain white paper. Inside was a child's drawing. A mountain with a green slope, a blue sky, and a stick figure holding a walking stick. At the bottom, written in uneven pencil, were 4 words: "Thank you for listening." I sat there a long time holding that piece of paper. My wife used to call me her living seismograph, always sensing shifts before anyone else noticed. Maybe she was right, but I knew then that it wasn't just about predicting. It was about listening not only to the ground beneath our feet, but to each other. The mountain no longer groaned. It no longer whispered warnings in the night. It breathed again, steady, slow, alive. And in its quiet, I finally found something I hadn't felt in years. Not just peace, belonging, because in the end that's what the mountain had been trying to tell us all along. The land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it, and if we care for it, if we listen, it will carry us, forgive us, and remind us who we really are.